The alarm cut through the corridor before I even opened my eyes, and I knew something was wrong. Not the usual maintenance chime, not a drill. This was the deep, grinding tone reserved for hull breaches and enemy contact, a sound I had only heard twice in my 6 years on this station, and both times someone had died before the sound stopped. My name is Caliph Vor, and I am a Sevreni, born under the twin sons of Vethra, raised in a culture that measures worth by strength, by how loudly your claws can be heard on a battle deck, by how many times your name is spoken with fear. I came to Station Halvin 9 years ago as part of a joint alliance program, one of the first Sevreni officers to serve alongside the newest members of the galactic community, the humans. When I first heard about humans, I laughed. My commanding officer had shown me a data file: soft skin, no natural armor, no claws worth mentioning, weak eyesight in the dark, slow reflexes compared to nearly every other species in the Alliance. They had been allowed into the community out of pity more than respect, given quiet posts, translation work, supply management, anything that kept them away from the parts of the galaxy where things could go wrong quickly. That is where I met Ethan. He worked 2 decks below me, in logistics, cataloging supply crates, and filing transport requests. Quiet, polite, always the first to apologize, even when it wasn't his fault. Always the one who let others go first, through a door. When the other officers laughed at him behind his back, calling him fragile, calling him the harmless one, he never seemed to mind. He would just smile and go back to his work. I did not expect to fall in love with him. Sevreni do not choose mates lightly, and certainly not humans. But there was something in the way he listened when I spoke. Really listened, not just waiting for his turn to talk. There was a stillness in him that I found more comforting than any show of strength I had known before. When my own father questioned my choice over a static-filled comm call, I told him that strength wasn't only claws and teeth. I almost believed it. Almost, because if I am honest with myself, sitting here now with the alarm still ringing in my ears, I have to admit that some small, embarrassed part of me had always wondered if I made a mistake, if I had settled. If, in choosing someone gentle, I had chosen someone the galaxy would always see as lesser, and by extension, seen me the same way. I grabbed my sidearm from the shelf by the door and pulled on my boots, my claws clicking against the metal floor as I moved. Through the thin wall, I heard Ethan's voice, low and calm. "Caliph, stay behind me when you go out." I almost laughed, even with fear crawling up my spine. Stay behind him, as if his soft human body could stop anything that was coming for us. I did not say this out loud, because even in that moment, some old instinct told me to be kind about it. "I'll be fine," I said instead. "You should get to the shelter pods with the other logistics staff." He didn't answer right away. When I turned to look at him, he was already dressed, already at the door, his hand resting against the frame in a way that looked almost too relaxed for a man who should have been afraid. "I'll walk with you partway," he said. The corridor outside was full of noise, boots against metal, voices shouting over comm units, the low hum of emergency lighting flickering on in strips along the ceiling. Officers from a dozen different species pushed past each other, some rushing toward defense stations, others toward the escape pods reserved for non-combat personnel. I saw a Threll officer, all 6 limbs and armored plating, barking orders into a comm unit. I saw a young Vantic technician crying quietly as she was pulled along by a colleague, and I saw humans, dozens of them, moving toward the escape pods without argument, without hesitation, exactly where they were supposed to go according to Alliance protocol. Weak species stay out of the way. That was the unspoken rule, and it had never bothered me before. Today it made something twist uncomfortably in my chest, though I could not say why. "What is it?" I asked Ethan, my voice tighter than I meant it to be. "What's attacking us?" "I don't know yet," he said, which was probably true, but something in the set of his jaw, some tension around his eyes that I had rarely seen before, made me wonder if he knew more than he was letting on. We reached the junction where the corridor split, one path leading toward the Defense Command Center where I was stationed, the other leading down toward the shelter pods. Ethan stopped walking. "This is where I go," he said. I nodded, relief and guilt mixing together in a way I did not have time to examine. "Be safe." He reached out and touched my arm, just for a moment, his fingers warm against my scaled skin. "You too. Trust your training. Trust yourself." It was such a small thing to say, and yet something about the way he said it stayed with me as I ran the rest of the way to command. As if he were not just offering comfort, but reminding me of something I would need very soon. The command center was chaos when I arrived. Captain Desarin, a broad-shouldered Threll with silver plating along her arms, stood at the central display, snapping orders to a dozen officers at once. The main screen showed a shape approaching the station, something dark and irregular, not a standard ship class that any of our scanners recognized. "Unidentified vessel," Desarin said without looking up. "Weapons hot, shields at maximum, and they are not responding to hails." "Pirates?" I asked, taking my position at the tactical console. "Too organized for pirates," said Officer Kessa, a Vantic with pale blue skin and large, worried eyes. "Their approach vector, their formation, this looks military, but there's no signature match in the database." I felt the old fear creeping in, the kind that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the unknown. Sevreni pride ourselves on facing danger head-on, but facing danger, you understand, is very different from facing something with no name. "Range in 90 seconds, Kessa said, her voice climbing higher with each word. I glanced at the secondary screen showing station status, checking the shelter pod occupancy without really meaning to. Ethan's name appeared on the list, safely logged into Pod 7 along with the rest of the logistics staff. Good. He was safe. Whatever was coming, at least he would be protected behind reinforced plating designed to withstand almost anything, except what came next. The unidentified vessel opened fire before it even reached weapons range that our systems considered possible, some kind of long-range projectile that tore through our outer shield array like it wasn't there at all. The station shuddered violently, alarms shifting from warning tones to something far more urgent. Sparks rained down from an overhead panel. Kessa was thrown from her chair, and I caught myself against the console just before I would have fallen too. "Shields down to 60%, someone shouted. "They're not slowing down," Desarin's voice cut through the panic, steady despite the danger. "All defense stations, return fire. Do not let them get closer." I turned to my console, my claws moving fast across the controls, coordinating the station's limited defensive turrets toward the approaching threat. My hands were shaking, just slightly, a thing I would never have admitted to anyone. Around me, officers from a dozen species fought to keep the station standing, some calm under pressure, others clearly terrified but doing their duty anyway. And through all of it, one thought kept circling back in my mind, quiet and strange. Ethan's voice, telling me to trust my training, trust myself, as if he had known, somehow, that this was coming. As if the calm in his eyes back in that corridor had not been simple courage, but something closer to certainty. I did not have time to wonder about it for long, because the vessel outside grew closer, and the true shape of the danger we were facing was about to become clear to all of us, in a way none of us were prepared for. The vessel stopped just outside effective firing range, close enough that our sensors could finally pull a clearer image onto the main screen. It was not built like any ship in the Alliance database, all sharp angles and no visible markings. Its hull, a dull black that seemed to swallow the light around it rather than reflect it. Captain Desarin stared at it with an expression I had never seen on her before. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. A recognition that whatever this was, it did not follow the rules the rest of us lived by. "They're not firing again," Kessa said, her voice tight. "Why aren't they firing again?" "Because they don't need to," Desarin said quietly. "Look at our shields." I looked. Shield integrity had dropped to 40% after that single strike, a number that should have taken a sustained assault from 3 warships to achieve. Not one shot from an unmarked vessel we had never encountered before. Whatever weapon they carried, it was far beyond anything our defenses were built to withstand. A voice crackled through the comm system, distorted and mechanical, refusing to identify itself or its species. It gave us a demand instead. Surrender the station, hand over all technology and personnel records, or be destroyed along with everyone aboard. Discern refused, of course, because that was her duty, but I watched her hands tighten on the edge of the console as she did, and I understood that she did not believe we could win this fight. For the next several minutes, the vessel simply held its position, and I found myself staring at the tactical display, my mind racing through every scenario I could think of, and finding no good outcome in any of them. We were a mid-sized alliance station, not a warship. Our purpose was diplomacy and trade oversight, not combat against an enemy this powerful. That was when the reports started coming in from the lower decks. Small craft had been launched from the unidentified vessel, boarding pods, dozens of them, aimed not at our defense stations but at the civilian and support sections. My blood went cold as I understood what that meant. They were not trying to destroy the station outright. They wanted something inside it, and they were willing to send troops in to take it by force. Pod 7. The shelter pods where Ethan was supposed to be safe. "Captain, they're targeting the civilian shelters," I said, my voice cracking slightly despite my best effort to keep it steady. Desseran's jaw tightened. "Redirect all available security personnel to the lower decks. Protect the civilians as long as possible." I wanted to go myself, every instinct screaming at me to run toward Ethan, but my post was here, at tactical, coordinating what little defense we had left. I forced myself to stay, my claws digging into the edge of the console hard enough to leave marks, watching the display as security teams scrambled toward the lower decks, watching the boarding pods draw closer on the scanner. The first breach happened faster than any of us expected. A section of the outer hull near the civilian quarters buckled inward, and armored figures poured through the opening before our security teams could properly organize a defense. The feed from the corridor cameras showed chaos, officers and civilians running in every direction, some trying to fight back with whatever weapons they carried, most simply trying to survive. I watched the feed with growing horror as the invaders moved with brutal efficiency, clearing corridor after corridor, heading with unsettling precision directly toward the shelter pod section. It was as if they already knew exactly where to go, as if the layout of our station had been studied long before this attack ever began. "They're heading for Pod 7, Kessa said, reading the same feed I was watching. "Caliph, isn't that—" "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I do not remember deciding to leave my post. One moment I was standing at the console, the next I was running, ignoring Desseran calling my name behind me, ignoring every rule about tactical officers remaining at their stations during an active engagement. All I could think about was Ethan, trapped behind reinforced plating that was clearly not going to be enough to stop what was coming. The corridors were worse than the camera feeds had shown. I passed bodies, some Sevreni, some Threll, some Vantic, all of them people I had worked alongside for years, and I forced myself not to stop, not to think about it, because stopping meant losing time I did not have. My claws were out, my sidearm ready, every combat instinct my species had bred into me for generations rising to the surface. I turned a corner and found myself facing 3 of the invaders directly. They wore full armor, faces hidden behind dark visors, and they moved with a kind of coordinated brutality that told me immediately these were not simple raiders. This was a trained force, disciplined, dangerous. I fought because I had no other choice, my claws finding gaps in their armor where I could, my training taking over in a way that left little room for conscious thought. I took a hit across my shoulder that sent fire through my nerves, but I kept moving, kept fighting, because stopping meant dying, and dying meant never reaching Ethan. I do not know how I survived that corridor. I want to say it was skill, but honestly, I think it was simply desperation, the kind of strength that comes only when there is something you cannot bear to lose. By the time I broke free of the fight, my shoulder was bleeding freely, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and the Pod 7 corridor was just ahead. What I found there stopped me cold. The reinforced door to Pod 7 had been torn open, not blasted, not cut with tools, simply torn, the thick metal bent outward like paper. Inside, the shelter was in disarray, chairs overturned, personal belongings scattered across the floor. And scattered among them invaders, at least 6 of them, lying motionless in positions that told me clearly they were not simply unconscious. I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. The other civilians, the logistics staff, the technicians, the administrative workers who had been sheltering here, they were pressed against the far wall, alive, terrified, but alive, and standing between them and the fallen invaders was Ethan. He was not the man I had left in the corridor an hour before. His posture had changed entirely, no longer soft or apologetic, but coiled and precise, his eyes scanning the room with a sharpness I had never seen in him before. There was blood on his hands, not his own, and his breathing was calm in a way that felt deeply wrong given everything around him. "Caliph," he said, and his voice was the same voice I knew, gentle even now, even with 6 armored soldiers lying still at his feet. "You're hurt." I could not find words. I looked at him, then at the invaders on the floor, then back at him, trying to understand how any of this was possible. Ethan, quiet Ethan from logistics, who apologized when he wasn't at fault, who let others go first, through doors, had somehow dismantled a squad of armored invaders with what looked like nothing more than his own hands. "How," I finally managed to say, "did you do this?" Something flickered across his face, an old weariness that had nothing to do with the fight he had just survived. He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, the comm unit on the wall crackled to life with an announcement that made the blood drain from both our faces. The invaders were not retreating after this failed attempt. According to the station-wide alert, a second and much larger wave of boarding pods had just launched from the unidentified vessel, and this time they were heading straight for the command center, where Captain Desseran and the rest of my tactical team remained, cut off from reinforcements and running out of time. Ethan's expression changed instantly, all softness gone, replaced by something harder, something that made me understand, in that single moment, that whatever he truly was, I had only just begun to see the smallest piece of it. "Stay with them," he said, nodding toward the frightened civilians against the wall. "Keep them safe until security arrives." "Ethan, wait." But he was already moving past me, out into the corridor, walking toward the command center with a steady, purposeful stride, as if he were simply heading to another ordinary day of filing supply requests, rather than walking directly into the heart of an invasion that had already brought a fully staffed alliance station to its knees. I stood there for a long moment, torn between my duty to protect the civilians in front of me and an overwhelming need to follow him, to understand what I had just witnessed, to know exactly who I had chosen as my mate. In the end, duty won, though every instinct in my body screamed at me to run after him instead. As I turned to help the shaken civilians to their feet, I heard something over the comm channel that made my chest tighten with a fear unlike anything the unidentified vessel outside had caused. Captain Desseran's voice, shouting orders, followed by the unmistakable sound of the command center doors being torn open, the same way Pod 7's door had been torn open only minutes before. Whatever Ethan was walking into, it was about to test him in ways far beyond 6 armored soldiers in a shelter pod, and for the first time since the alarms had sounded, I found myself praying not for the station, not for the alliance, but for him. I got the civilians moving toward the secondary shelter zone, half carrying an elderly Vantic administrator whose legs would not stop shaking, when Kessa's voice broke through my personal comm unit, breathless and full of static. "Caliph, you need to hear this. The command center is under direct assault. Captain Desseran is requesting all available combat personnel, but most of our security teams are pinned down on the lower decks fighting the first wave. We don't have anyone left to send." "I'm on my way," I said, even though every rational part of my mind told me that running toward the command center with a wounded shoulder and no backup was close to suicide. "Caliph, wait," There's something else. Kessa's voice dropped lower, confusion bleeding through the static. There's a man walking through Corridor 9 right now, alone, heading straight for the breach point. Security cameras just picked him up. He's not in uniform. He's not carrying a weapon that we can see. Do you know who this is? My chest tightened. That's Ethan. Don't stop him. Just watch. Watch him do what? Caliph. He's about to walk directly into at least 15 hostiles. I did not answer, because I was already running, leaving the civilians in the care of 2 Threll technicians who had just arrived to escort them the rest of the way. My shoulders screamed with every stride, but I pushed through it, following the same path Ethan had taken only minutes earlier, desperate to catch up, desperate to understand. By the time I reached Corridor 9, the fighting there was already over. I want to describe what I saw accurately, because even now, replaying it in my memory, some part of me struggles to believe it happened exactly this way. The corridor was littered with fallen invaders, their armor cracked and dented in ways that suggested tremendous force applied with terrifying precision. Not a single one of our own security personnel lay among them. Ethan stood near the far end of the corridor, his posture relaxed again, as if he had simply finished a routine task rather than single-handedly disabling an entire squad of armed soldiers. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and for just a moment, before his expression settled back into calm control, I saw something raw pass across his face. Not pride, not excitement, something closer to grief. "You shouldn't be running on that shoulder," he said. "Ethan." My voice came out sharper than I intended. Fear and confusion, and something like anger all tangled together. "What is happening? What are you?" He looked at me for a long moment, and in that pause, the station shook again, another impact from the unidentified vessel outside, reminding both of us that this conversation would have to wait, that there were still lives depending on what happened in the next few minutes. "I'll explain everything," he said. "I promise you that. But right now, Desseran and your tactical team are still in danger, and I need your help to reach them faster than I can alone. You know these corridors better than I do." It was such a strange thing to hear, this quiet man I had shared a home with for years, asking for my help despite what I had just witnessed him do without any assistance at all. But there was truth in his words. The command center was still under attack, and standing in a corridor demanding answers would not save anyone. "This way," I said, pushing my confusion aside as best I could, and we moved together through the station, deeper into the chaos. What followed was unlike anything I had trained for in my entire career. We encountered 2 more groups of invaders along the way, and each time, Ethan moved with the same terrifying efficiency I had witnessed in Pod 7 and Corridor 9, disabling armed soldiers with what looked like minimal effort, always careful, I noticed now, to avoid killing when he could help it. He struck to disable, to remove a threat quickly, not to destroy. Even in the middle of what should have been a desperate fight for survival, some part of him was holding back, exercising a level of control that unsettled me almost as much as his strength did. I fought alongside him where I could, my claws and training finally proving useful, though I could not shake the feeling that I was little more than a guide showing him the way, rather than an equal partner in the fighting itself. It should have wounded my pride. Instead, it filled me with a strange, unsettling awe. When we finally reached the command center, the scene inside told its own story. The reinforced doors had been torn open just as I feared, and Captain Desseran stood at the center of a small, desperate defensive line, her armor scorched, one arm hanging awkwardly at her side, clearly injured. Around her, the surviving members of my tactical team fought with whatever they had left, exhaustion written plainly across every face. Invaders pressed in from the breached entrance, more of them than I had expected, at least a dozen still standing. "Ethan," I started to say, a warning, a question, I am not sure which. He was already moving. I will not pretend to fully understand what I witnessed in the next several minutes. Ethan moved through that command center like something out of an old Sevreni legend, the kind of stories told to children about warriors blessed by ancient spirits. Except there was nothing mystical about what he did. It was skill, refined over what must have been years of training I had never known about, combined with a strength that defied everything the Alliance database claimed about human physical limitations. He disarmed an invader with a single precise movement, using the attacker's own momentum against them. He caught a strike meant for Desseran's exposed side and redirected it into the wall hard enough to crack the reinforced paneling. He moved between defenders and attackers, like water finding the fastest path downhill, always exactly where he needed to be, always doing exactly enough to neutralize a threat without wasting unnecessary force. Within minutes, the invaders who could still move were retreating, dragging their fallen comrades with them, clearly recognizing that whatever they had been sent to accomplish was no longer achievable. The remaining defenders in the command center stood in stunned silence, weapons still raised out of habit, staring at the man who had just turned the tide of a battle they believed was already lost. Captain Desseran lowered her weapon slowly, her eyes fixed on Ethan with an expression I had never seen on her broad, armored face before, something between disbelief and recognition, as if pieces of a puzzle she had never known existed were suddenly falling into place. "You're human," she said, not quite a question. "Yes," Ethan answered simply. "That's not possible." Desseran's voice was rough with exhaustion and confusion. "The Alliance records on human combat capability are incomplete," Ethan said, cutting her off gently, without any hint of arrogance in his tone. "Deliberately incomplete." I felt the ground shift beneath everything I thought I understood about my mate, about his people, about the quiet, unassuming role humans had been given in the Alliance since their arrival. Deliberately incomplete records did not happen by accident. That was a choice, made by someone, for reasons I could not yet imagine, before anyone could ask the questions clearly forming on every exhausted face in that room. The station shuddered violently once more, this time accompanied by a deep, groaning sound that seemed to come from the very structure around us. Red emergency lighting flooded the command center, and a new alert scrolled across the one remaining functional display. The unidentified vessel outside had stopped simply threatening the station. It was now charging some kind of weapon far larger than the one that had already stripped away most of our shields, and according to the sensor readings still trickling in, we had less than 10 minutes before that weapon would be ready to fire. Desseran's exhausted expression hardened back into command focus immediately. "All remaining power to shields. Get every non-combat personnel into the deepest shelter sections. If that weapon fires with our shields at this level, this station will not survive." Ethan stepped forward, and something in his voice, calm but absolute, cut through the rising panic in the room. "There won't be a need for that," he said. "Not if you give me access to a shuttle, in about 8 minutes. Every eye in the command center turned toward him, disbelief and desperate hope mixing together on faces from 4 different species. I stared at the man I had shared a life with for years, the man everyone had dismissed as gentle, as harmless, as ordinary, and understood, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had not truly known him at all. What he did next would answer every question I had, and reveal a truth about humanity that the entire galaxy had somehow overlooked. Desseran hesitated only a moment before nodding to one of her officers. "Get him to Shuttle Bay 2. Whatever he's planning, we don't have a better option." I grabbed Ethan's arm before he could move. "You're not doing this alone. Whatever this is, I'm coming with you." He studied my face for a long moment, and I braced myself for him to argue, to tell me to stay safe, to protect me the way he had been protecting me for years, without my ever realizing it. Instead, something in his expression softened, just slightly, and he nodded. "All right," he said. "But you do exactly what I say, when I say it. No hesitation." I nodded, and we ran together toward Shuttle Bay 2, the station groaning around us with every passing second, the countdown to that massive weapon charging somewhere out in the dark, drawing closer with each breath. The shuttle bay was in worse condition than the corridors we had passed through. Part of the ceiling collapsed, emergency crews working frantically to clear debris away from the remaining functional shuttles. A young Threll technician named Orlin waved us toward a small, fast reconnaissance shuttle, the only one still fueled and ready for immediate launch. "This is all we have," Orland said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "It's not built for combat. It barely has shields." "It'll be enough," Ethan said, already climbing into the pilot's seat with a familiarity that told me this was not the first time he had flown something like this. I strapped myself into the seat beside him, my mind racing through 100 questions I did not have time to ask. The shuttle bay doors ground open, revealing the vast darkness outside, and beyond it, the massive, angular shape of the unidentified vessel, its surface now glowing faintly along several long ridges, a clear visual sign that whatever weapon it carried was nearly ready to fire. "Ethan," I said as the shuttle lurched forward into open space, "what exactly is your plan here?" "That ship's weapon needs a stable power core to charge," he said, his hands moving across unfamiliar controls with confident precision. "Every weapon system like this has a vulnerability point, usually near the charging coils, where the energy output is highest and the shielding is thinnest, because that's where engineers assume no one would ever get close enough to strike. And you know this how?" He was quiet for a moment, guiding the small shuttle in a wide arc away from the station, positioning us for an approach toward the enemy vessel that made my stomach twist with fear. "Because I've flown against ships built by the people who designed this one before, a long time ago, before the Alliance ever heard of Earth." The weight of that statement settled over me slowly as the shuttle picked up speed, cutting through open space toward a vessel that had already crippled an entire Alliance station with a single shot. Before the Alliance ever heard of Earth. That meant humans had fought this enemy, or one very much like it, long before joining the wider galactic community as the weakest, most protected species among us. "Who are they?" I asked. "The ones on that ship." "Remnants," Ethan said, his jaw tight. "Survivors of an empire that Earth fought against for nearly 2 centuries before the Alliance made contact with your people. We called them the Ashkar. Most of the galaxy has never heard the name, because Earth made sure of that, kept the worst of that history contained, quiet, out of Alliance records." "Why would you hide something like that?" He glanced at me, and in his eyes I saw exhaustion far older than his years, a weight that had nothing to do with the last hour of fighting and everything to do with a lifetime of carrying secrets. "Because the galaxy already fears what it doesn't understand, Caliph. Imagine what it would do with the full truth of what humans survived to get here." I did not have time to ask another question, because the shuttle's proximity alarm began blaring, warning us that we had entered the enemy vessel's detection range. Ethan's hands moved quickly, cutting power to non-essential systems, dropping our energy signature low enough that we slipped past their outer sensors, a maneuver so precise it must have taken years of practice to perfect. "There," he said, pointing toward a section of the vessel's hull where the glowing ridges converged into a single bright point. "That's the charging coil. If I can get close enough to place a disruption charge directly against it, it should overload the weapon before it can fire." "Should? Will," he corrected, though I noticed he did not sound entirely certain, and something about that honesty, even in the middle of this impossible situation, made me trust him more rather than less. He guided the shuttle into the vessel's shadow, using its own hull as cover from any remaining sensors, until we reached a section near the glowing ridge where a small docking port sat unguarded, likely an emergency maintenance access point never meant to be used during an active engagement. "I need you to fly this shuttle to a safe distance once I'm outside," Ethan said, already moving toward the small airlock at the rear of the craft, pulling on an emergency suit that had been stored beneath his seat. "Wait for my signal, then come back for me." "Ethan, you cannot go out there alone, if there are more of them." "There won't be many left guarding this section," he said, checking the suit's seals with practiced efficiency. "Most of their remaining forces are still trying to recover from the losses back on the station. This is our best chance." I wanted to argue, every instinct screaming at me to refuse, to insist on going with him, but I understood, watching him prepare with calm, focused determination, that this was something he needed to do, and that arguing further would only cost us time we did not have. "Come back to me," I said instead, my voice breaking slightly, despite my best effort to keep it steady. He paused at the airlock door, looking back at me with an expression I will carry with me for the rest of my life, gentle and fierce all at once. Always. The airlock cycled open, and he disappeared into the darkness outside, a small figure against the massive hull of the enemy vessel, carrying nothing but a disruption charge and years of training I had never known existed within him. I pulled the shuttle back to a safe distance, exactly as he had instructed, my hands trembling against the controls as I watched his suit's tracking signal move steadily across the vessel's surface toward the glowing charging coil. The minutes that followed were the longest of my life. I watched the signal stop near the bright ridge, watched it hold steady for what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a minute or two, and then watched it begin moving again, faster now, retreating back toward the shuttle's position. "Get ready to move," his voice crackled through the comm, tight with urgency. "Charge is set. We have maybe 90 seconds before it goes off." I brought the shuttle in close, opening the airlock the moment his suit's signal was near enough, and he practically threw himself through the opening, sealing the door behind him with hands that were, for the first time since I had known him, shaking slightly. "Go," he said, "now." I did not need to be told twice. I pushed the shuttle's engines to their limit, angling us away from the enemy vessel as fast as the small craft could manage, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the roar of the engines. Behind us, through the rear viewport, I watched the glowing ridges along the enemy hull suddenly flare bright white, then erupt in a cascade of explosions that tore through the vessel's structure from the inside out. The shockwave caught our shuttle, throwing us forward against our restraints, alarms blaring as the small craft's systems struggled to compensate for the violent turbulence. When the chaos finally settled and I dared to look back again, the massive vessel that had threatened to destroy our entire station was breaking apart, its dark hull crumbling into pieces that drifted silently into the void. We had survived. The station had survived. I sat there for a long moment, breathing hard, staring at the wreckage of a ship that should have easily destroyed us, disabled entirely by one quiet man from logistics who apologized when it wasn't his fault and always let others go first through doors. "Ethan," I finally said, my voice shaking with the aftermath of everything that had just happened, "I think it's time you told me exactly who you are." He looked at me, exhaustion and something like relief settling into his features now that the immediate danger had passed, and for the first time since the alarms had sounded hours ago, he did not try to deflect the question or offer a partial, careful answer. "Yes," he said quietly, "I think it is." And as the shuttle carried us back toward the station, back toward the life we had built together, without my ever truly understanding the man beside me, Ethan finally began to tell me the truth about who he really was, and what humanity had endured long before the rest of the galaxy ever knew we existed. We docked back at Station Halvan to find it in a state of exhausted celebration, crews from every species working together to patch hull breaches, tend to the wounded, and confirm that the threat outside had truly been eliminated. Captain Desirand met us at the shuttle bay entrance, her injured arm now in a proper brace, her expression unreadable as she looked at Ethan. "The Ashkar vessel is confirmed destroyed," she said. "Sensors show no further threats in range. Whatever you did out there, it worked." "It was a weak point in an old design," Ethan said simply. Nothing more. Desirand studied him for a long moment, and I could see the questions building behind her eyes, the same questions building in mine. But she only nodded slowly. "There will be a full report required. Alliance Command will want answers about what just attacked us, and how a member of our logistics staff was able to single-handedly turn the tide of this engagement." "I understand," Ethan said. "I'll give you everything I can." Desirand left us then, moving off to oversee the ongoing repairs, and Ethan led me quietly toward a small observation deck near the medical bay, a place we had gone together many times before, simply to sit and watch the stars after long shifts. It felt strange to return there now, after everything that had happened, as if the peaceful room belonged to a different life than the one I had just survived. We sat together in silence for a while, my shoulder finally tended to by a medic, wrapped tightly enough that the pain had dulled to a manageable ache. Ethan sat beside me, his hands loosely clasped in his lap, staring out at the stars with an expression of quiet, tired resignation. "Before the Alliance made contact with Earth," he began, "we spent nearly 2 centuries fighting a war most of the galaxy never knew about. The Ashkar came to our system uninvited, decades before any Alliance scout ever found us. They saw a world full of resources and no defenses worth worrying about. They were wrong. 2 centuries, I repeated, trying to grasp the scale of what he was describing. Humanity has always been resourceful when threatened, he continued. We didn't have advanced technology in the beginning. Not compared to them, what we had was determination and an unwillingness to simply accept defeat. It took generations, but we learned. We adapted. We built weapons, strategies, training programs designed specifically to counter an enemy that saw us as nothing more than an easy conquest. And you, I said quietly, you were part of that. He nodded. I was born near the end of it, trained from childhood in combat methods most people, human or otherwise, will never need to learn. By the time the war finally ended, when we drove the last significant Ashkar force out of our system, an entire generation of humans like me had grown up knowing nothing but conflict. Then why hide it? I asked. Why let the Alliance believe humans were weak when you had survived something like this? Ethan was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully, because when Earth finally made contact with the Alliance, our leaders made a choice. They saw how other species reacted to power, how quickly strength could be turned into fear, and fear into conflict. They decided it would be safer, for humanity and for the galaxy, if we entered this community quietly, without drawing attention to exactly what we were capable of. So you let everyone believe you needed protecting. We let everyone believe what was convenient, he corrected gently. It gave us time to learn about the Alliance, to understand who could be trusted, before revealing anything that might change how we were treated. Most humans serving in the Alliance today have no combat training at all, Caliph. That part wasn't a lie. But a small number of us, those who survived the worst of the war, were placed carefully throughout Alliance space, quiet observers, ready to act if something like today ever happened. I thought about the deference other humans on the station had shown him, small gestures I had barely noticed until recently, and understood now that they had known, or at least suspected, exactly what he was capable of. Why me? I asked. Why let yourself fall in love with someone from a species that measures everything by strength, when you were hiding the very thing my culture values most? Ethan finally turned to look at me directly, and the softness that had first drawn me to him all those years ago was still there, unchanged, despite everything I now knew. Because I fell in love with you before any of this mattered, Caliph. Because for the first time since the war ended, I found someone who saw me as a person rather than a weapon or a burden, and I did not want to lose that by revealing something that might change how you saw me. You thought I would love you less, knowing the truth? I thought you might love me differently, he said quietly. I've seen how Sevreni values strength above almost everything else. I didn't want our relationship to be built on what I could do in a fight. I wanted it built on who I actually am when the fighting is over. I reached out and took his hand, feeling the same warmth I had always felt from him, unchanged despite the blood that had been on those same hands only hours earlier, unchanged despite the impossible things I had watched him do throughout this long, terrifying day. You were wrong to worry, I said. I do not love you any less, knowing what you survived, what you're capable of. If anything, I understand you more now. The quiet you carry, the patience, the way you always let others go first, none of that came from weakness. It came from someone who has already seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, and chose gentleness anyway, whenever he had the choice. Ethan's eyes softened further, something like relief washing over his exhausted features. I was afraid you would see me as a stranger. I see you as the same man I have loved for years, I said. just with a fuller understanding of everything that shaped him. We sat together in comfortable silence after that, watching the stars slowly resume their steady, familiar path outside the observation window, the wreckage of the Ashkar vessel already fading into the vast darkness behind us. Around the station, repair crews continued their work. Alliance command ships began arriving to assist with recovery efforts, and slowly, gradually, life aboard Station Halvan began returning to something resembling normal. In the weeks that followed, the truth about what had happened spread throughout the Alliance, carefully managed by human diplomatic staff who finally, cautiously, began revealing more about Earth's hidden history. Not everything, Ethan told me later. Some things were still considered too sensitive to share fully, but enough that the galaxy's understanding of humanity began to shift in ways that would take years to fully settle. Other species reacted with a mixture of respect and unease, exactly as Earth's leaders had always feared they might. Some Alliance members grew more cautious around human personnel, wary of a strength they had never suspected. Others, like Captain Desseran, simply adjusted their expectations, treating Ethan and those like him with a professional respect that had been noticeably absent before. As for me, I found that my own perspective had changed in ways I had not expected. I had spent years quietly wondering if I had chosen a mate beneath my station, embarrassed by his gentleness in a culture that prized strength above almost everything else. Now I understood that true strength was never about how loudly you announced it, but about the restraint you showed when you had every reason not to. Ethan remained in logistics after everything settled, despite offers from Alliance Command to transfer him into a formal combat role now that his abilities were known. He told me once, sitting together on that same observation deck months later, that he had spent enough of his life fighting, and that he intended to spend whatever peace he could find simply living, cataloging supply crates, filing transport requests, and coming home each evening to someone who finally understood every part of who he truly was. I no longer felt embarrassed introducing him to visiting officers from my homeworld. When my father finally traveled to Station Halvan to meet him in person, expecting, I think, to find the same soft, unremarkable human he had questioned my choice over years before, he instead found someone whose quiet confidence commanded respect the moment he entered a room, no claws or armor required. My father did not apologize for his earlier doubts. Sevreni rarely do, but he shook Ethan's hand with a firmness that told me everything I needed to know about his changed opinion, and later, when we spoke privately, he told me that he finally understood why I had chosen the way I had. Looking back on everything now, I think about that morning when the alarms first sounded, about the small, embarrassed doubt I had carried for years without ever fully admitting it to myself. I think about how close I came to losing him that day, and how much I would have lost without ever truly understanding who he was. Ethan was never ordinary. He simply chose, every single day, to be gentle when he could have been anything else, to apologize when he did not need to let others go first through doors, not because he lacked the strength to push through himself, but because true strength has never needed to prove itself to anyone. I chose him again, that night on the observation deck, and every day since, not despite the power he had hidden from the galaxy for so long, but because of the quiet, deliberate kindness he showed in choosing to hide it, protecting not just a fragile peace between species, but the tender, unremarkable life we had built together, one gentle, ordinary day at a time. And if the galaxy ever wonders again what humanity is truly capable of, they need only look at a man who could level a warship with his bare hands, and still remembers to say thank you to the officer who brings him his morning coffee. That, I have come to understand, is the truest measure of strength there is.